So next up, we have our next session, and about No Surprises Act, surprise, and managing data strategically. And so we've got Lynda Rowe from InterSystems and Vanessa. Welcome back to the stage. And I'm going to let them do any further introductions that they need to. But they're going to talk about challenges with and solutions for managing disparate data to meet the requirements of NSA. Thank you.
Thank you. So, let's see. Can you hear me? Yeah? Thank you, everyone. I'm Lynda Rowe, Senior Advisor, Value-Based Markets at InterSystems. Just for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a healthcare technology company. We've been in business for over 40 years. We provide solutions around interoperability, data sharing, and do a lot of work in the payer, provider, and life sciences space. And I'm going to turn it over so Vanessa can introduce herself.
She also has the best colors on her badge with all the different things. I've got a little yellow, blue, yellow going on, but I'm Vanessa Candelora. I'm with Point of Care Partners, which is a boutique management consulting firm. And I do most of my work and seem to get a lot of podium time because I am part of the project management office for the Da Vinci project, which is an HL7 fire accelerator multi-stakeholder collaborative. My organization is also involved in a lot of the standards work and interoperability work that we do in the US.
So before we get going, my head hurts after this morning. I just have to say that there's so much complexity. Interesting story. My husband had to go to an urgent care center in Florida. We don't live in Florida. This past winter, we walked in and we sat down. He's moaning. He's in very much pain. And there is a whiteboard, and it said, out-of-pocket cost. And it listed all the procedures and the cost you would have to pay. And he looks at me, he says, what is that? And I said, that's if we don't have insurance, if our insurance doesn't cover it, how much we'd actually have to pay. He says, you're kidding me. So that was one way to address it, right? You walk in an urgent care center and you get a nice poster board that tells you sort of how much you have to pay out of pocket. I found that very interesting. So Vanessa and I are going to chat as we go through this, but I think one of the things that we see as a theme is that it's all about data. There's a lot of data that gets moved within your organizations, across payer and provider organizations, between you and your patients. And sometimes we forget how disparate that data is and that it doesn't often live in the places we wish it would live. And that, there are folks in industry, and Vanessa's going to talk about the work at the Da Vinci project, where we're trying to figure out better ways of using and moving the data, but thinking about that data strategically as opposed to as individual pieces of information that you have to pull. So we're going to talk, I'm actually not going to talk about sort of the goals, just kind of highlight that, what's the No Surprises Act and why do we care? What's that big picture? Talking about it as a strategic asset, and then I love it, the benefit and beauty of HL7 Da Vinci, because we participate in Da Vinci. We think it is a beautiful thing to be able to do what they have been doing at scale. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about managing provider information. We've talked a little bit about provider directory data, but I think one of the things, people have talked about the problems, and I want to talk a little bit about strategically how we and our customers think about managing provider information and cleaning that data up, because we talked about how, ugly provider data is, because it does live in silos. And so just talk about that, and then some takeaways. So, bottom line, we are trying to prevent surprises to patients, right? That's the whole goal, because bankruptcy in the US, top reason for bankruptcy is healthcare costs. That's pretty alarming, because that means a lot of people lose their livelihood because they are presented with a big surprise that they can't pay for. But I want to say that everything I've heard this morning, all the different panelists and speakers, it's all about the data, right? So we have to actually have an up-to-date and accurate provider directory, because if a patient relies on inaccurate provider information, then they actually have the right to dispute that. For uninsured individuals, right, we've been talking about the whole dispute resolution and price transparency. Guess what? There is data that's involved in actually making that happen. And then, transparency sections regarding provider directories, advanced cost estimates, out-of-pocket costs, provider price comparison tool. We're talking about that, but think about the data. So here's what I like to think about, right? What do they have in common? Well, there's a lot of provider information that you have to rely on. And Vanessa, I'd love you to comment on this because I know you've been doing so much work in this. And the negotiated rate, whether a provider is in-network, out-of-network, whether the patient's enrolled in the plan or not, or if they have insurance or not. The spent deductible. So if you think about those accumulators, I haven't heard anybody use the word accumulator, but guess what? That's really important because Vanessa and I had this conversation. Again, we can chat about it, but if I have a really high deductible plan and I'm trying to make a decision about whether to have a certain care, and somebody runs an estimate, my health plan runs an estimate for me based on my accumulator, and that cost is something I don't want to pay for out of pocket, I might defer that care. I might say, oh, I'm just going to do the dribs and drabs. And actually, Vanessa said she might do the opposite. She might say, I'm going to just do it all at once, right? Hit that high deductible. But we have to think about those pieces as well. And then,
I'll
there's...
just add,
particularly
if you're a patient and you're on a calendar health plan, right, and you're coming up on January, deciding if you want to have a procedure in December versus January when your accumulators start over, it's a really important piece of information you'd want to know as you're planning your care for those non-urgent procedures, right? So that's what a lot of this data is really important to help get organized, and it is in different places, and be able to pull together for a patient to make those informed decisions.
And then the last is, there's the cost of the procedure. Well, what is the cost? Oh my goodness, we have so many versions of cost in this industry, right? We have the cost that's, on the charge master. You have the cost that you actually have listed with your payer that you've negotiated, but then there's the actual cost that you charge me, the patient, because you've covered some of that for me. So what is cost and who keeps track of that? But Vanessa, I'd love you to comment a little more broadly just on a lot of this different data and how you've been seeing it across different health plans, different provider organizations.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We've been seeing it across plans, across providers. It looks a little different. Pulling it all together is a challenge. And when I look at this list, of course, we're talking about No Surprises Act today and provider directories, and this data is going to be a huge part to that. But a lot of this overlaps with other use cases, as we'd call them, or business problems where you'd want data to support your consumers. And so thinking about this holistically, I'll talk a little bit more about in the coming slides, but they all tie together. And so thinking about how your data works together within your four walls and with how it comes in and out is going to be a key piece to the long-term success. Did I say what you were thinking?
Oh yeah, always. So again, I think that I love this. We need to manage our data strategically because right now it often does live in silos, right? It lives in the revenue cycle system. It lives in 7 different places when you're looking for provider information. The cost information may live at the TIN level, but guess what? It might actually also live at the practice level, depending on your relationship with the organization. So how do we think about harmonizing that and holistically using, I always love the expression, accumulate once, use many, as opposed to go back to the source every single time you need to use it. So taking a step back, there are way more regulations, right? We've touched upon some of the other ones, and Vanessa's going to go into that. They all need that data strategically managed. If you think about just one regulation and here's the data and here's the process for that, you're kind of missing an opportunity. And, many people have touched on price transparency and other rules, but you start thinking, if you made a spreadsheet of the overlap of the data you need for so many of these regs, you could actually come up with a superset that says, wow, if we have this all in one place, we could then just pull it for each of these use cases and then apply the right business rules and analytics to do it. And so, and then those use cases get a lot easier. And so I think one of the wonderful things is HL7 Da Vinci is really tackling many of these use cases, relying on the fact that they're hoping their end users, their organizations that are doing this, have actually harmonized their data, right? So the use cases around value-based care, but then use cases that are specifically for support of these federal regulations. So I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa, and you just tell me next slide.
I will, thank you. I'm curious, by raise of hands, how many people are familiar with HL7 Fire? Great. And how many people are implementing or involved in a project with a partner that is implementing HL7 Fire? Okay, great. And familiar with the Da Vinci project? Raise of hands. Most of you. Okay, good. Thank you. Next slide. So the Da Vinci project, I saw a lot of hands. I won't spend too much time. Essentially, for those of you that didn't just raise your hand, we are a multi-stakeholder collaborative. So what that really means is a whole bunch of very smart people across the U.S. healthcare system, payers, providers, government, vendors, HIEs, all kinds of people came together and said, hey, this thing FHIR is pretty awesome, and let's use it to solve business problems to try to get us to value-based care in this country. And so that is exactly what they did about 5 years ago. I have the pleasure of sitting up here getting to talk about all the great work that some of you have done in this project. And we continue to add more use cases or business problems to solve. Oh, next slide.
I know, I'm going backwards.
Yeah.
Is this there? Sorry.
There, perfect. So these dials each one of these dials is a different implementation guide that takes base FHIR and applies it to a specific business problem. And to Lynda's point earlier about how a lot of this data is reused, what we are looking to do is harmonize with multiple other stakeholder collaboratives, other standards organizations, to try to reduce the barrier to implement technology to solve these business problems. And so, go back.
Oh, I didn't touch it. It's just like got a mind of its own.
Oh, okay. There might be a timer on it. I'll just have to talk really fast. So the goal, the point here is that there's different areas of focus that we are working on. I'm just going to keep talking. Okay. We are solving, I think it was mentioned really early this morning, Michael is very passionate about No Surprises Act as well as prior authorization. We have 3 guides that are helping to streamline prior authorization. One of the things that we try to accomplish in the Da Vinci project is not just the technology, but the workflow, right? How do we really solve these business problems with workflow? And a lot of what we recognize that our organizations that participate with us struggle with is not just the technology, but the business transformation, right? So what we heard on the last panel and what we've heard this morning, a lot of No Surprises Act is going to be a challenge with how to change those business processes, how to get the data in place to then apply the interoperability that the Da Vinci and FHIR brings to the table. This slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about our patient cost transparency use case in just a minute, but what we're really trying to show here is that all of these things build on each other, right? So last July, we saw a lot of implementations of the interoperability, patient access API and interoperability, 9115, and then the transparency and coverage rule came out, which was talked about this morning. I won't spend too much time. And then we are likely to see, and we did see, and Penn did rule for 9123, which then builds even more on those initial APIs. So APIs are happening. How many of you have implemented an API? Raise of hands. Yeah, okay. Probably about half. So, APIs are happening now. We're starting to hear, how do I manage multiple APIs? How do I organize my APIs? That's sort of where this is headed to solve some of these problems. And it's going to continue to build. As we heard at the CMS HL7 Connectathon a couple weeks ago, the first day was a lot of really great policy updates from CMS and ONC, and they talked about how, they're going to continue to build on interoperability and see it as a really critical point to where the industry is headed.
I just want to add one thing because, as our customers have implemented patient access API and provider directory APIs, right, sort of the rule around peer-to-payer has been sort of pended. We're waiting for more guidance on that to come from CMS, but they are all saying, so what else can we be doing with these, our FHIR APIs? We now have all this data and we have our APIs and we're connecting to, third-party apps, but are there other things? And I say, well, let's talk about Da Vinci. Let's talk about some of the cool things we could do with the FHIR APIs and the data that you've aggregated to go on your journey. So I think there's a lot of synergy between not just, sort of the regulations, Vanessa, but also the pathway that our customers can take. And
Absolutely, absolutely. Each one of these, we call them building blocks that can be put together to solve whatever core business problem you're trying to address. That's really the goal. Next slide. We talked a lot about this morning, how these regulations start to overlap, and there's different things to think about as you're approaching how to address one of these. And, there was a question earlier today that was, have we lost sight of the goal here, right? And I think that the point was made that it's really essential that we stay focused on what we're trying to achieve with a shopping tool, with the No Surprises Act, getting estimates to patients, and how we can leverage the data that we have and the interoperability tools to not have to repeat everything that we're doing with each business partner that we have. And we will see increased regulation at the federal level. Next slide. So what is patient cost transparency in the Da Vinci use case term? We are set out to develop a standard data exchange to support patient cost transparency data. We've been informed by the No Surprises Act portion of it, which is the good faith estimate from providers to payers, and providing an API for exchange of that data, as well as an API for patients to access their advanced explanation of benefit from payers. We also recognize that data comes in all these different arrows in all these different directions, depending upon who's involved, depending upon what the services is, depending, right? And so to get a cost to a patient before the service is performed, I think we all can agree that it's a bit of a challenge in where we are today in the industry. And so the goal here is to give the industry an option for technology to be able to exchange that data to reduce that manual burden, hiring FTEs to have to do this work. Next slide. So this is a workflow diagram, very high level. In the Da Vinci project, we like to put visuals to the work that we do. So very simply, the trigger of a patient scheduling a service would allow a provider to compose that good faith estimate information and submit it to a payer via FHIR, and then the payer would compose their advanced explanation of benefit. What we're seeing is it's usually a copy of a claims adjudication system. We worked really hard, and we're working very closely with other standards organizations to align how this works today for claims so that the estimates can be as accurate as possible. So we've leveraged the great work of other standards organizations, including X12, who you'll hear from tomorrow, to make the barrier of implementation easier, and also to align with how costs are created today so that those estimates can be very closely aligned. So what we're seeing is payers will basically create a copy of their adjudication systems and run the estimate data, everything they get from the provider, through up to the point of actually, getting to payment and committing to the accumulators, and then be able to produce an advanced explanation of benefit to patient. We also have an optional dotted line here back to the provider. Our community felt really strongly that we want to incorporate the provider or providers that are part of the estimating so that they can have the conversation with the patient who may likely come to them when talking about these estimates, trying to understand them. We talked a lot about patient education. Generally, your patient's going to go to their provider, so we wanted to make sure that that health information equity is available across all parties in this role. Next slide. So this is an example of what an implementation guide would look like. We are in the stage of a balloted guide, which means it went through an HL7 open voting and commenting process in January, and we are now reconciling all those comments and applying them and updating our implementation guide. So we expect to, we're targeting a publication of a standard for trial use guide by the end of this year, but we've already seen through Connect-a-thon events that people are picking it up, including EdFX, who some folks are in the room from, to demonstrate how this can work in the real world. So this guide is an open source, publicly available standard that you can leverage to implement with your partners for data exchange. It's something you could pick up now. It's available. There's a URL right there. We have a continuous integration build because we're always iterating on the work that we do. And if you think about aligning your internal processes, your technology, your data with this type of, the way that the FHIR resources are organized, that's a really good step towards interoperability. Next slide. I think that's it, yeah.
And before I pivot to a different topic, one of the things we often talk about, because people look at these implementation guides and sometimes their eyes glaze over.
Yeah.
And so the way we talk about it to our customers who may not be so technical is think about a recipe, right? So a recipe comes with essential ingredients. And so either you or your vendor partner have those essential ingredients. You got to make sure you've got those. So you read the IG to make sure. And then what does the recipe do? It tells you step by step sort of how you put it together. And if you really read through an IG, it really does talk you through step by step. Now, one of the things I would say is any good cook has variations. And I would say with every provider and payer partner we work with, there are variations, and that's okay, right? Because you're still sort of following the basic recipe of how you're trying to accomplish this. And so I really like the model and the beauty of how easy it is. It takes people a while. They kind of pick it up and they're trying to figure it out, but once they get it, it's really quite easy to actually get it up and running. And I know I have colleagues out here who have worked with many partners that have been doing the same thing. All right, so I'm going to pivot really quickly before we do some Q&A, because one of the things I want to talk about is we've talked about provider directory data. There was a whole panel, and I totally agree, and I have a lot of the same data points, right? But, there are market imperatives. Why do we care about having an accurate provider directory? Well, it's a good thing actually to do for your patients or your members, but, there's the CMS rules called on exposing provider directory information through open APIs, and that was part of the panel earlier. And there's a piece of the no surprises, although there's been no rulemaking around it, it certainly sits in the actual regulations. And same thing, on the provider directory, on the provider side, on IDNs, large health systems, it's the same thing, right? There's a whole bunch of activity going on. There's mergers and acquisitions. It's supporting new care models like value-based care, managing referrals. And then again, the No Surprises Act, because by the way, the information that your payer has comes from the provider side. And so as good as any payer is at managing the data, they're only as good as the data they get from their provider network. So I think one of the things, though, that one of the use cases and one of the things our customers did early on is they realized that they needed to be able to give good information when they got an inbound call from a patient looking for a new provider, or because we, like people were saying earlier, you can go and search on the directory, but it doesn't give you all the nuance and subtlety that you may be looking for, like, oh, when's the next appointment available? You know, does this provider speak my language? Are they even accepting new patients? Because, by the way, I did this secret shopper thing where on the provider site, it didn't tell me whether they were accepting new patients. So I then had to go to my payer site and go to the member portal and search, and it said, oh, sorry, they're not accepting new patients right now. So then you have to go through that whole process again, right, to say, okay, well, what's the next provider candidate I might want to look at? Obviously, a lot of us just do this through word of mouth. But if you want to stay within your sort of same organization, you know, some of us older folks have loyalty to our long-standing relationships, right? You kind of want to stay within that network. You're not willing to say, oh, I'm just going to go to, you know, urgent care clinic. So it's a big thing to be able to actually have conversations with patients that are more meaningful than just the data that you present on your website. So I love data, and people talked about this earlier, but you know, 25% yearly turnover in provider rosters, and somebody said, you know, it's like 5% a week or something. It's a big turnover, and I would say that during COVID, that turnover was a lot higher than it was prior, which is when this data is from. And so that means the best. So if you get no updates, the best you can be at any given point is like 75% accurate. Second, you know, health plan can have thousands of contracts, right? And for each contract, they could be collecting 140 plus data elements for each contract they have. That's a huge amount of information you're trying to manage. And so we want to think strategically about, well, how do you manage that data? And again, a typical practice holds, you know, 12 managed care contracts. So again, same thing. And it's horrible that we have to use the fax machine. I'm totally with the hashtag, you know, kill the fax. Because I think if you want to think about how to re-engineer healthcare really quickly, make the fax go away. And people would start to figure out different ways, I mean, of doing business. So again, really simply, a lot of this is, I hate to say it, it should be about customer and member experience, but it's about meeting those regulatory requirements. And provider directories have Medicare, Medicaid, federal insurance, no surprises. And then 9115 had, you know, Da Vinci PlanNet was a suggested IG. So there are all these different reasons why you would actually want to have good data in your provider directory. And by the way, you know, I know when the panel talked that Vanessa was on earlier, they talked about sort of the APIs have garbage. Well, what I always tell my customers is, well, if you are not curating your data, then you are providing garbage, you know, because if you're not managing your data, and we actually worked with an industry analyst at IDC, and he basically said, managing your provider data is not a project. It's not something a one and done. It's a program, and you really have to think about it strategically. So again, I actually am going to skip this slide because I like this slide better. So there is so much information that is affiliated or associated with an individual provider. If you think about it, there's the language, the licensure, the credentialing, the hours they work, are they accepting new patients? I mean, this is just a subset of the information, but if you think about all those data elements, by the way, all those data elements don't live in one system typically in a traditional either health plan or provider organization. They live in your credentialing system or your outsourced credentialing. They live in your PeopleSoft system if it's HR data. They live in your contracting. They live in your billing system. It's all over the place. And if you're not thinking about how to manage that, then it is going to be inaccurate because you're pulling from all these different places. So one of the things that we like to think about is sort of there's data at two different levels, right? There's the data about sort of the where is that provider actually located. So their sort of provider information. And in this case, we're showing Dr. Holly Barnes and Dr. Holly Wheeler. They're actually the same provider, but they have different information. And when you look at that, you can actually figure out and do some some matching to say, okay, how do I figure out which is the correct information? And then there's the master record, which is sort of says, okay, well, what do we know in terms of the network that's participating in, right? So Dr. Holly Wheeler has this MPI and these health plans, and our specialty is family medicine. So there's sort of the different layers of the onion that you have to think about and peel when you're thinking about how you would manage provider information. And then you've got the master record, right, that actually says, okay, we've seen this, and the master record is showing that we have one identifier that points to the fact that Holly Barnes/Holly Miller practices at 2 different locations. She's accepting patients at one, but not at another. And one of the stories, there's another thing I love to talk about. So my OBGYN for many, many years started out as a private practice. And he saw patients, 5 days a week at small practice, really easy provider directory entry. Then he got acquired by a large IDN. And so he was now part of a larger practice. He didn't practice, his office hours were different than they were when he was his own private practice. And then as he moved closer to retirement, he decided he wanted to do pro bono work every Friday for a federally qualified health center. And by the way, when he was at the FQHC, he needed interpreters, so he could accept people with different languages. And he also accepted folks with no insurance and on Medicaid, which he wasn't seeing in his other practice. So think about all that data and who's managing that data, and how do you know if you could see him on a Thursday at his private practice versus Fridays at his FQHC. So there's a lot of information you have to manage. So I'm going to be real quick so we can get some comments here, but the way we want to think about this is we think about a process for managing information, sort of translating, preparing that information, splitting it out when we have it so we can figure out what belongs to that master record, sort of what's at the higher level, and then what's at the sort of lower level, what's the sort of provider information. We match it, we build it, but then we share it. So if you think about all that data processing that has to go until you get to that share, and that share is APIs, that's the FHIR information. So from our perspective, again, the data model is about both provider organizations and their relationship with locations, their relationship with the individual providers. So if you think about a large health system as individual providers, they practice at locations, but then within those locations, there are a relationship in terms of who you contract with, what networks you're in, what health plans, and not just what plans, but what actual, specific PPO, HMO that you actually accept. And then there's the actual contract administrator. So we try to think about a data model that would support all of that. And before I do the key takeaways, one of the things that we like to think about in that curation is that when we bring the data in and we go through the matching process and the curation process, there's a work queue where we drop out things that we don't think are a match. And again, that's sort of something you can tailor to say what's the match criteria on either end. But we also look at different data sources having different reliability. In other words, you can never overwrite credentialing information unless it comes from a credentialing system. So if you get credentialing data from another system, you can't overwrite it. So you can set up rules that do things like that so that you're not, as you're sort of curating the data and bringing it in and creating this master golden record, you're not overwriting data that you know is good and healthy. But I'm going to summarize some key takeaways, but then I want Vanessa to also chime in because we just work very closely with POCP, do a lot of great work with them. So, I want people just to think about your data and managing that data, because if you're not managing it, you can't share it. Or if you share it, it's not very good data. And it can't live in silos. You've got to think about ways to bring together and curate your information so that it's all in one place, whether that's a data lake or your data warehouse or some platform where you're bringing it together for not just one, but multiple use cases. And, if you're not involved in Da Vinci, you should think about it, because they're harnessing data to support all these great use cases around value-based care, about around all these federal regulations. And again, when you've got the data there to move back and forth and you harness FHIR, there's tremendous things you can do. And like I said previous, managing this data is not a project, it's a program. So Vanessa, please wrap up.
My wheels are turning, and I know it's after lunch, and people are probably done listening to me second time around here. But when we think about provider data and all the different uses and what we talked about in this session and on the panel earlier, I think there really is just so much opportunity, right? If we think about the patient experience and what we want consumers to experience 5 years from now, right? They should be able to put their care team together, know their providers, endpoints across those care team, have the data be accurate, be able to pull down their clinical information from those endpoints of the providers, know what their plans are, have cost, and we didn't talk a lot about quality. This isn't a quality, but I think that cost is really one major, but one important piece of many to decision making for consumers, and your quality data is going to be specific, right, to providers, and there's just so much data flowing everywhere, and the folks that got on the data lake train when that became a big term a few years ago, I think are probably on the right track, right? But just getting it all usable. Right? Data is only as good as it's usable. And so I think that is key. And once we can understand the data that we have, clean it up, harness it, be able to communicate it with others, that's where we can get to success.
So I think we have, a few minutes if folks have questions.
Yeah.
And if you don't, it's
straight back here.
yeah. Go ahead. Yep.
We lost Michael. Yeah, it's nice to meet you. Yeah. Yeah, you heard me hesitate when I got to that point in the workflow, huh? So I normally have a much longer talk track in these slides. The convening provider and co-provider gathering of good faith estimates, as most of you know, is part of the self-pay uninsured that was talked about on the last panel, and earlier this morning, Terry Cunningham mentioned it too, and Michael. But the advanced explanation of benefit is not, we don't know what's to come there, right? We do in the Da Vinci project have a proposed project to use, we think the community believes there's a lot of value in using FHIR for providers to communicate with one another. So that, I think, answers the real question. So yes, it is not part of the work that we've done to date. We recognized early on, I actually have a timeline slide. We started this use case in 2019, and we had to shelve it at one point, and then we picked it up again in 2020, and then transparency and coverage came out, no surprises came out. We did a ton of discovery before we even launched to public meetings, and now we meet for 2 hours every week on Fridays from 11 to 1 Eastern. So it's a lot of work. I'm really grateful for the community of 30 to 70 people that have shown up over the course of this project's life cycle with patient cost transparency. But we learned early on that the convening and co-provider and how gathering the good faith estimate information, whether it be providers, payers, whatever role everybody plays, is something that we really need to work on the business workflow, understanding, and changes that need to happen there before we just apply technology to it. Right? So getting that business transformation, understanding how it works, we're learning a lot from the self-pay side, and we think there's value for FHIR there. And we do plan on starting something. There's actually, I was writing up a proposal for it on my plane ride here yesterday. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great
Other
question.
questions? All right, happy to give folks a few minutes back, and we can segue to the next section. Thank you.
Thank you very much.